Hi, I want to start out this new year by asking kind of a big existential question that I bet some people have thought about a fair amount, but I bet not that many people have really thought about too much. And the question is, should you be a pastor? Now, I'm going to say pastor a lot, but what I want to say is that the things I have to say about being a pastor also apply, though perhaps in a slightly less full way, if you're called to a full-time Christian ministry. They may not be exactly the same, but there's going to be an awful lot of overlap. So just keep that in mind, even if I don't always say, and full-time ministry. Now, if you're anything like me, you have found yourself, at least at some point in your life, among a group of people who are very much in favor of people becoming pastors. It's seen in some circles as being the way that you can dedicate your life to Christian service, and the way to be able to have a professional and lifelong commitment to the gospel in a way that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Obviously, I'm not against people becoming pastors. I'm a pastor. Many of my very dear friends are pastors, and I know that God does and still indeed call people to be pastors. But I want to point out some things that may not have occurred to you if you feel called to be a pastor, or if you're thinking about that as one thing that God might be calling you to do, because there are some things that I have discovered and have noticed since becoming a pastor that I didn't know when I began, and it might be helpful for some people to know it ahead of time. When I was in high school and I was just graduating, I was part of a small group of guys, and it was amazing because several of us were going off to college, we had a time when we were gathering together and we were sharing what God was calling us to do and calling us to be and where we were called to go. And around the table, every single one of us announced that they had felt a call to full-time Christian ministry in one way or another, except for two of us, myself and one of my friends. And the funny part is, I haven't kept up really closely with all that group of guys, but at one point anyway, it was funny to notice that out of that whole group of people, only two of us had actually been called into full-time Christian ministry, myself and that same other friend. Now, I did discover recently that another one of those group friends is working full-time at a church, but it's in an administrative position and not necessarily in a ministry position. And that is in absolutely no way to downplay the importance of the work that they're doing, as this video should make very clear. To help set the stage for what I'm trying to say, I want to tell a story of two particular experiences that I had, because they were very interesting for me to live them and also to think about them. There was one time I was at a coffee shop that was run by some friends of mine, and I was getting some work done while I was in seminary, and someone came in, and I can't remember how the conversation started, but very quickly we were talking about very deep things. We were talking about life and meaning and art and beauty and all these kinds of things that make life so interesting. And we're going along, and it was like one of the fastest times I've ever connected to a person. But the funny part is, before too long, he eventually asked me a question. It's a perfectly ordinary question, the kind of question that gets asked all the time when you meet somebody. Travis, what is it that you do for a living? And I wasn't going to lie, and so I told him that I was a seminary student, and I was already serving as a pastor and training to really fully engage full-time as a pastor. What was amazing is that even though we had spent the better part of an hour connecting over a variety of things, in that moment you could see and feel the wall go up between us. All of a sudden, he was no longer sure that he wanted to talk to me, no longer sure he wanted to connect the way we had been connecting already. There was something about finding out that I was a pastor and a pastor in training that somehow made him very unsure whether he wanted to really be around me. There was another situation where I was asked, along with several of our friends, to help out at a continuing education event for the workplace of another friend of ours. And our job was just to kind of sit there, keep track of people signing in and signing out. But in any case, a vendor of a product had arrived early to the session. And I was sitting there, and I was reading actually a commentary on the book of John, because I was preaching through John at the time. And somehow the topic came up after this conversation that I was a pastor of a church and I was a seminary student. And amazingly, it wasn't so much like the wall had gone up, but all of a sudden the conversation shifted. All of a sudden this person felt it very important to tell me several stories about experiences he has had in the church. Not necessarily bad experiences. I didn't get the sense he was trying to be hostile to me, but it became very clear to me that he was recounting to me every single time he had been in a church over the last several decades. It's as if he wanted to try to show that we could still be together, that he still wanted to have this conversation. This was the point of contact. And because he couldn't share about a life that he had that was living and dynamic in Christ, he had to share what he could, which was, here are the 4 or 5 times in my recent life that I've been inside of a church. What I found very interesting in both of those situations, and I've had other situations like that, but those are the ones that kind of stick out in my mind as the kind of paradigm cases of this, is that I was in a situation where the possibility for interpersonal, connectional ministry was happening. And then it was precisely because I was a pastor that kind of put the brakes on it. It was precisely because of my identity as a clergy person that made the other people feel like they needed to keep their distance from me. If you're feeling a call to full-time Christian ministry or to be a pastor, it might take many forms. Speaking for myself, where God was calling me in that direction was due to things I felt a call and a love for preaching and teaching and to lead people in that kind of way. And after becoming a pastor, I began to fall in love with leading the church in its sacramental ministry. But I never saw the idea that being a pastor would somehow make me, in certain circumstances, fundamentally less qualified to do the ministry that needs to be done. Now, why should that be? I think that when I was younger, I thought of if you've met someone who would turn out to be a pastor, you would be more able to speak to them about the things that matter, about meaning, about life, about faith, and about all those things. It was such a surprise to me to discover that being a pastor actually could prevent that kind of ministry from taking place. So it raises the question of why? Well, I don't know if this is the only thing that matters, but here's something that certainly seems to kind of go along with that. Several years ago now, there was a research study done by Pew Research, and one of the things that they asked people was about different kind of organizations and different kinds of institutions. And the question was basically, does this organization or institution have a net positive impact on society or a net negative impact on society? And they did this with all kinds of different generations and with all kinds of different institutions, banks and the government and all the rest. Well, one of the things was, does the church have a positive impact on society? You could say, is the world a better place because the church is in it? Yes or no? According to that study that came out a few years ago, the number of millennials, now I realize that millennials are not the youngest generation anymore. I don't know quite how this breaks down for those of you who may be younger than millennials. But among millennials who are about my age and the next 10 or so years younger, the only 45% said yes to that question. Now, I've tried to explain to people who are especially entrenched in the church to say that's not like 45% love the church and 55% are not quite so committed to it. That's saying only 45% of millennials can bring themselves to say that the world is a better place because the church is here. That means 55% of people cannot be brought to say that the church makes the world a better place. That is a staggering statistic. And one of the things that says to me is that someone like me, who is professionally identified with this frankly distrusted institution, shares some of that distrust. When someone looks at me and discovers that I'm a pastor, they lump me in with a whole raft of presuppositions about what it means for someone to be a pastor, to be a Christian, to be part of a church. And not all of those presuppositions are very flattering. And it may be that many of them, maybe all of them, are not true. In my case or in the case of many other people. But it doesn't change the fact that I get lumped in with this. So what that means is that if you become a pastor, what that will do, and it certainly will do this, is it will open the doors to doing certain kinds of ministry that you will either not do as often, perhaps, or you certainly may not have the opportunity at all to do some of these things that you would if you were not a pastor. Preaching, you will probably preach more often as a pastor than if you're not one, although plenty of lay people preach on a regular basis. You may or may not be able to lead the church in communion, depending on the church that you're part of. You probably will not be able to baptize people if you're not some kind of clergy. Oftentimes there's no rule in many churches that a non-clergy person can preside over funerals, but oftentimes it is clergy who minister in that way. And those are some certain things that are at least more often done by clergy people than non-pastors. But you need to understand that becoming a pastor and tying yourself professionally to a distrusted institution may actually close the door on a great deal of the kind of ministry that really needs to be done. That actually, it can be said that most of the ministry that really needs to be done not only should not be done by pastors, but cannot be done by pastors. The church cannot do what it needs to do without active, vibrant, committed lay people who are not receiving a paycheck from the church or from ministry, or certainly not finding their full income from those sources. I'm in a denomination that needs pastors. We're having some kind of shortage of clergy people in my United Methodist Church. We are called to recruit people to pastoral ministry. And I think that if God is calling you to be a pastor, you should go and do it. But if the calling is not necessarily to the pastoral ministry, but just you have this overflowing of desire to do the work of God in the world, consider, pray, continue to discern as to whether God is calling you to this particular kind of vocational ministry. Because it's very possible that in order to do the ministry that God has put in your heart, you may be more effective if you are not professionally involved in the ministry. As a passionate volunteer, you can communicate the love and the care and the compassion that God has called you to have more clearly to the receiver than someone like I can. So should you become a pastor? Well, I don't know for you. I haven't been the one who's been praying on your behalf. I'm not the one who the Holy Spirit is speaking to about that topic. You are the only one who can know that for sure based on what God is telling you. But I would encourage you to think it over very carefully. Take that question as seriously as you can. Do not jump into something unless you know for sure God has called you to do it. Because God has ministry for you available, whether you're a lay person or whether you're a clergy person. And the only question is, to which is God calling you? And what do you need to do to be best prepared to do that kind of ministry? Well, that's all for this week. If you have found these videos helpful, consider liking the video or sharing it with your friends on Facebook. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel these things are hosted at. My channel is tstevic1. If you have any questions or if you have any topics you would like me particularly to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevic@gmail.com, and I'll try to get it worked into the rotation, and I hope to see you next time.